Hi, welcome back. Thanks for staying with us and joining us in this 20th guided meditation, ever deepening journey into the source life, the life in source. And we've seen that that is the greatest human journey ever, from our very arising as humans. And a guided meditation means we're not just doing information, we're seeking to really, through access to the code of the source, the DNA for the source field, that all of our great teachers and scriptures have been seeking to open up and pioneer for us. And we're using the double brackets, as you've seen, over and over, to mark that space, that code, that matrix, the motherboard, whatever name we use for the fundamental reality. It's a reality code, the DNA for being. And we're in the missing science that we've spoken of, the source science. It is a science of being. Deep ontology is a word for it. First philosophy. It got derailed along the way, but it's been from the beginning. Our great geniuses were trying to get to the language of what is first, because it's all important life and death for us humans. To be in intimate interface and interconnection, interflow with the source. And in our journey, in this meditation today, on the 20th meditation, at the end of the 19th, we began to see, I hope, that when we look at dysfunctions across the planet, in our human cultures, wherever we are, all our cultures, there are clearly deep issues, things that are wrong, pathologies. Humans are suffering different kinds of personal and interpersonal, cultural, interrelational dysfunctions, whatever name we use. And we're suggesting that when we follow the trail of our great teachers over 2,500 years, they've all been seeking to call that out, to diagnose it medically, to see that there's a matrix that we've been stalled within in our development, which has enabled us, but also disables us, and can create profound suffering, chronic, deeply entrenched suffering in our human condition. And in this meditation, we would like to look at that from the source science, from medical ontology. As we open up the missing science with the source code, what is that code? I am. To put it bluntly and simply, the journey to I am, when we can say I am, each person, she crosses into a deeper space where we're not talking about it, but we're being it. When we tap source, we're tapping the field, the infinite source of flow, of reality, of being. And if we're desourced, then we're stalled at some level and talking about it in an I-it technology or matrix. So what we've seen in our journey, the deepest journey ever, to source life, is to see and suggest that when we look at the wisdom of our planet and our enlightenment journeys over the past 2,500 years to bring us to where we are, we've been using this visual, this meditative visual as a cosmogram, a hologram, a meditative visual summing up our current human condition. And by now I hope it's getting more familiar how to read this, that the infinite is the sign of the infinite space, the double brackets to mark it out, the infinite, the Unum, the infinite unity. And we've been repeating that over and over, that the infinite is infinitely one. And that really is the key to the entire breakthrough. Because we cannot understand infinite one within the language in which we live and the cultural space and rational technologies and word and meaning and truth and science, all that we have here. Right? We cannot understand the infinite unity, which is actually basic ontology, that the infinite is infinitely one. You can't divide it in any way. It can't be partitioned or broken in any way or divided. And it means that we need a higher voltage, rational power and calculus and DNA to tap it and be one with it. And we can't stand outside of it. We have to surf it within. And when we're in the zone, in our peak moments, and we step out of our ego-based ways of thinking and flow in that Zen zone, so to speak, or Christ zone, or Buddha zone, or yoga zone, just to pick up a few, or the Logos zone, when we are in that deep flow of deep ontology, we are sciencing. And that's where we're healthy and whole and thriving and free and fully human, and compassionate and love in relationships that flow. So here's a startling consideration for us. It's a what-if question. What if we discovered through source science, deep ontology, which has been missing and been pioneering by our great teachers, and we're here now, and we have the source code, the DNA for the field of reality, the infinite flow. What if we discovered that we humans have been living colonized by a thought form, a deeply implanted matrix that has been holding us captive and cutting us off from source and from ourselves and from flourishing and well-being and happiness and deep knowing and science and love and ethics and reason, all of the great things that we cherish. What if we've been cutting off from a deeper access, as great as we are now? And there's no question that we humans, and when you look at the great arts and the genius of science and research and medicine and technologies and political advances and human rights and the activism, all this is great. But what if we have been laboring under a deeply implanted and invisible, not yet fully seen motherboard, matrix, code, covenant, conventions, whatever name you like, they're all interplaying. Memes, so memes, codes, conventions. So when we think of the code, the covenant with God, what if we've been stalled and not really seeing the depth of that covenant? The word of God, the code of God. What if? What if we've been blocked and need to go deeper to get the word of God, scripture? Or to tap reality more deeply in the unified field? So what if that's really what we're journeying into, to suggest that with source science we could see that there has been and is presently a dominant, deeply implanted matrix or covenant or conventions or form of reason and language and thought and consciousness and life that is blocking us from access to source, to the I am awakened, enlightened space that we're all born for and to and have that code within us, and it's been blocked somehow. What if? That's really what we're looking into more deeply. In all of these meditations from 1 through 19 and now into 20, I'd like to go deeper and to suggest that when we see that clearly, it gives us a whole new lens, a whole new global science, a deep medical science, a deep source science, to look at our human condition and the vast range of scattered dysfunctions and suffering and pathologies that we have and named, that they're all coming from, and this is what's unprecedented, they're all being generated by this motherboard, the matrix that holds us captive, that's deeply implanted. So that's going to be our main focus in this journey. And what we should remember, I mean, if we had to distill it in the simplest way, what we need to remember is if we can make this crossing from here, I've been suggesting we are here, and this is what we indicated has not been seen. This is the marker for the matrix, the motherboard, which is a smotherboard because it cuts us. These lines come together, the red lines. When you have this, you have that, and that cuts us from the source. And the challenge of our human evolutionary journey is to cross into the space of compassion, of science, of truth, of knowledge, of being. This is the word of God, the word of Buddha, the word of Christ, the yoga. All of our great technologies are trying to help us make the crossing and to call this out. I mean, if we don't call this out, we can't make the crossing. And here's the main point. The infinite space, this space, and if we get this, it'll make it much easier for us to see why being here, to be de-source is a disaster, in effect. So the source medicine is going to say, if you're de-sourced from source, from being, from reality, whatever, from truth, here, this line is all important in understanding, by having our culture in our life here is going to be, by being de-sourced, is going to be scattered and inherently chopped and separated and sliced into pieces. With all of our efforts to connect it, Once we break the Unum circuit, the infinite continuum, reality is a boundlessly interwoven continuum. That's the deep inside of source ontology, source science. Reality is a profoundly unified interflow field. And the technology that dominates our development, our cultural development, our rational development, our cognitive development, our psychological, emotional development at this level is working with a matrix that divides and names and creates units and atoms that we then seek to join together. We played with the idea of that words are like Lego blocks, plastic Lego blocks that we try to put together, we put together. So what goes on in this space is that we improperly, unconsciously assume that we can sustain ourselves. Even if we say there is a higher power, we are still seeking to be self-sustaining. Whereas in fact, it is a source that is sustaining. It is a source field that sustains us. And that really is at the heart of, by being desourced, we fall into deep dysfunctions, pathologies, human suffering. And to end the suffering, we can't do it within this space. We have to somehow call this out, recognize this barrier, and upscript into the deeper space. What I'd like to do is to develop an alternative visual for us to help us see why this is so. Again, this is a profound unity. Relations here are profoundly interlaced. We don't create the relations, we are living within the relations. So in the I-thou relation, the relation is so deep that I can't sever it. I'm not making an I-thou relation, it makes me. When you're in the deep unified field. But when we're here, we make our relations. We could say, I love you, or I'm the father, you're the daughter, you're the son, you're my lady, or you're my lover. We create relationships. So there are relationships and links here, but it's not the same as the deep interflow, interlacing of the infinite Unum in this space. And we need to think about that because this is not unfamiliar territory. It means that any word here, like time, all words are connected with time. Now, all points of time are connected with now because it's infinite. The infinite calculus, the infinite matrix, the motherboard here of interconnectivity and interflow is so powerful. And it's always there. So even though we are cut off by our technology in this space, we are still connected to the source. It's holding us. Nothing could exist outside of the source. We are always sourced. And that's ABC science. Because why? Because the infinite cannot be pushed away. It's in every morsel, in every atom, in every electron, every breath, in every cell. It cannot not be. The infinite cannot be displaced. So basically what we're going to go into in this meditation is life here is desourced and therefore in some profound way disconnected, disjointed, discoherent, broken. Our being is broken. Here it's one, it's unified, it's boundlessly deep. Here it's boundlessly disconnected. And that is why being desourced is a source of our pathologies and dysfunction. And our great teachers are trying to call that out. Buddha, when Buddha saw that humans are here, he didn't use the single brackets, but he saw that we were using a calculus that presented ourselves as separate units of existence. It was a medical ontology diagnostic, ontology again, our being. If I'm a being and I'm a separate entity, and I'm living that mind space and culture space, he says that's a source of suffering. Because my being is not self-sustaining. I cannot be a separate being. Being is interflow. And if you're in this space, you're going to have ill-being. If your being is ill, then how can you have well-being and happiness? and flourishing. That was the medical vision. That's just one example of it. And we've gone over this over and over, but I'm just repeating that theme to help us go deeper now into calling out the deep, vast range of every aspect of life here. We've been building up to this. If this is where my culture is, and it's disconnected, and therefore it's using an artificial synthesis, like putting Lego blocks together to build units and connections, if I put love together with Lego blocks or human relations, in the I-it place, this is an I-it matrix. And an it is an object. And if we are using a matrix that objectifies all of our experience and our phenomena and ourselves and each other, if we are objectifying each other, naming and looking at the screen and objectifying, I'm here and here's my world, here are others in my world, in the I-it calculus, then we'll see that that is at the heart. Objectification is dehumanizing. If we objectify each other, it doesn't take much to say, oh, I can take you out. Already, just to objectify, even if I'm a good person, and we are good, but I'm objectifying myself and others, and that's the way of life. That's encoded in my culture. Our great teachers saw ethics, you never treat a person as an object, because objectification is dehumanization. If we objectify nature, we can say we can take out the forest. We could use it to our ends because it's objectified. So when we objectify without realizing sexism, racism, homophobia, ethnic cleansing, Holocaust, genocides, all of these are traceable to objectification. And we haven't seen that medically enough, because when you're in that matrix, you can't see what's causing it. You have to step out of the matrix, and that's what our great teachers. The journey to source is the journey to step back and see from a deeper lens, a deeper source code, the missing code of Logosophia, to see what our great teachers were teaching and pioneering, which is to call this out, name it. It wasn't properly named. It was known that we were disconnected and cut off, and we needed to overcome that and make this crossing. That's been seen. The great teachers knew, if you're going to do yoga, you've got to cross into the yoga zone. If you're going to be with Christ, you've got to surrender, die, to be born again. For those who have ears, let them hear. What does that mean? Ears are the double bracket code, the covenant. And that's an amazing thing. If the covenant is the source code, the code of God, and it's not accessible in our matrix of a desource code, a sin code, you can't find it here. So we've got to let this go in order to rise. So the weight of evolutionary consciousness and history and scripture and enlightenment and wisdom and the journey for truth and science and knowledge and ethics has been to go higher into the compassionate space of the moral law and the moral space, and not to download the teaching into where we are here. So we've seen that over and over in different ways, and that's really a premise and a prelogue or prologue to realizing why. If we're desourced, we're broken off, and if we're broken off, we're splintered, and if we're splintered, we're objectifying. If we're objectifying, all kinds of violence and malpractice will emerge. And just think of the vast range of human what's called existential symptoms, anxiety, facing death, the fear of death, and the angst about death, and despair. The sense that my world, my meaning, my whole life, I've been living a life thinking I have meaning, and somehow I know that something is wrong, something is missing. We know that something is wrong. Even though with all of the great things we have, something is wrong. And the journey we're on now is to see that what is wrong is when you're cut off from light, from life, from source, from being, from meaning, from truth, from knowledge, from ethics. That's hugely serious. And the greatest longing in the heart of every human being is the call of the source. This is calling us. We're always being called to the infinite call has been the journey to source, to find the code, the call to hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one, love me. That's a call of the source. It doesn't have to be an official call. It is always existentially, ontologically calling us. Being is calling us. Reality is calling us. Get real. It's calling us to code, upscript, journey, mature, evolve. That's been the relentless call of being. So if we're eclipsed from being, it's going to be dark. We're going to be in a cave. If we think that we can source ourselves, we can't. Reality sources us. The infinite source is holding us at every breath. But if we can't see it or feel it or know it, and we're cut off, and we're using a mental matrix that is deeply cutting it off, that's been our journey, to really keep focusing on this motherboard. There is a motherboard, it's a matrix, it's deeply implanted. We pass it on generation after generation. Our great teachers have been calling it out from all different directions, seeking to pioneer, name it, and help us make the crossing. And we've been stalled because that matrix is so powerful, we're colonized by it. We can't be free. And if we're caged and we want to be free range, we're going to suffer, we're going to feel it. We're going to have despair and angst. There'll be moments of suicide. What's the point? If there is no ultimate meaning, and I'm missing it, and the lights are off, that leads to existential despair, depression, insecurity, addictions, trying to medicate it. We're trying to fill the void. We're going to feel it. The call of Source is so profound if we don't, in a healthful way. And that's the way of opening the codes, coming to awakened consciousness, saying, I am. Which is what our great teachers, when you're doing yoga, you're amming. When you're doing Christ, you're Christing. When you're in the Buddha mindful, you're Buddhaing. When you're in the Logos, you're Logosing. In awakened rational light, that's when we come to be. That's when the lights go on. That's when joy and bliss and well-being and flourishing and love and compassion, that's the journey. But we've been stalled. So one of the simple ways to capture that is in the zone, in the source code, in well-being, the continuum, the Unum, the infinite Unum reality is a profound fractal continuum of interlace. Nothing can be broken apart. And we find ourselves surfing and upscripting and upgrading everything we know into that space. By making the crossing from being here in the cut-off space into the zone, into the higher space, we don't give up. What we give up is this. But if I have a family, I don't give up my family, I gain it. If I have a lover, I gain her or him. You gain when we go. When we upscript, we gain. We have science, and science is moving and beautifully advancing, but could it go deeper by opening up the unified field and the calculus and technology to encounter reality, nature, the universe in a deeper way with integral intelligence and scientific cognitive power? So everything is being upgraded. And here things are being degraded. So let's turn the page a moment to get one meditative visual that might help just capture that. And then what we'll do is just jump right in more deeply into let's look at a vast range of, just pick out different names. We'll come back to this page in a moment to keep our meditation going more deeply. But we're going to just look across our culture and to begin to see, wow, could it be that when we pick out any aspect, anything that is a crisis or a dysfunction or problematic, whatever name you, or pathology in our cultural space, when we see it here, we can't read, when we step back to look at it and say, wow, could this be the cause? Could this be the cause? And that's what our great teachers are suggesting. And that's what we're now seeing with deep ontology and ontological medicine, is that when we begin to see that the main scientific, medical cause of our dysfunctions and breakdowns experienced in life, in every aspect of our world here, this is where our world is, in this space, is going to be desourced. And if it's desourced, it's going to be in some kind of fragmentation and alienation and brokenness. Everything in our lives. So it's not just that they're specific inventory of local dysfunctions and pathologies that we can pick out here, but the whole culture is somehow has a virus. That's a startling suggestion with ontological medicine, that if we're living lives in the, under the sway of the motherboard, which is a smotherboard, and therefore cutting us off from source, and therefore cutting us from being and reality and truth, and higher knowledge, and compassion and love, and well-being and meaning, all of that, all the great things, we're being cut off. We can go higher. We have to upscript. And if we're cut off from that, that is really what is pathological. So everything within our culture is going to have the virus of this motherboard matrix. That's really unprecedented to suggest that in these stark terms. And that's really where we're heading in this guided meditation. So bear with me. I'm going to come back to this page, but I want to just jump a couple to show a visual that is easy to miss and it's important to have. I'll come back in a moment to this. I just want to turn 2 pages here. There we go. Okay, this is just, again, we pre-formatted this just to make it faster, but this is where all humanity is. Any culture, any discipline, any art, any science, any technology, whatever, it's going to be in the infinite space. The unum pluribus, the unum, infinite unity. But I want us to just block this out for a moment, because that's where we've been. We have not paid attention to that. Right? So, as we did in the prior meditation, just forget the blue marks for a moment. And I'm suggesting that in our human journey, that's what we've got. That's where we have, that's a screen of experience, our world, our culture, our meaning, our language, our word power. This is our word power. Not here. I don't have a line here across. This is all we have. So when teachers who speak from the source, let's put this in. When teachers speak from that matrix, the word of God, the word of yoga, the word of Om, the word of Tao, the word of Logos, whatever name we use for the Allah space, speaks to us, we download it to where we are. And of course, who's the we? Well, the thinker and what we think. That's a screen of our experience. Everything shows up as content. I'm calling that the objective. And it's extremely important because we don't realize that's what objectification is. Our matrix, I didn't put it in yet. I haven't put this in yet because we're not calling it that. We're just saying, here's what happens in culture. We download that into our space. We download the word of source. This matrix, we download it into our familiar space. We capture it in our box. That's been 2,500 years of our human pre-conscious journey. We hear the higher word and we translate it to where we are. And of course we know that there can be a higher word and a lower word. You can say, here is a human space. We're only human, and this is the God word. Or that's the Buddha word. Or that is the Logos. We could say, here's the word, Plato, here's the word of the senses, the body, and here's the word of reason, up here. There are 2 dimensions. The higher, this is the eternal, and this is the temporal. We can do that. We can have the higher and the lower in this box. And that's really what is very easy to do. We've been doing it for centuries. In other words, let's put in the matrix. And again, let's make it red, just to help us remember. This is the motherboard. And now we've got the cutoff. Without knowing that, we're being here and downloading the infinite into our word, we're cutting it off. You cannot have the infinite in the finite space. When you put it when you download the infinite matrix within our finite matrix, something profoundly wrong happens and wrongful. That's why the great teacher says, don't write the name of God. Because even if we make it as a higher and the lower, even if we do that, we're still within this motherboard. So I just wanted to help us visualize that. It's very easy to take the double brackets and bury it in here. Bring it down and put it in our space. When you do that and bring it in here, you lose it. Because this objectified space is a finite space and you can't take the infinite and download it into our space. So this is a bad idea. It's a bad idea. And even as I speak and I'm seeking to find a way to help us upscript and to call out the single bracket technology, I see it clearly because it was so buried we couldn't bring it out and say, there it is. It was pre-conscious and now it's conscious. I'm aware of it because I'm stepping back. And that's the journey to source. My task as coach is living with these great teachers and seeing the labor of centuries to call it out and go and upscript rather than download. So when I use double brackets, it's very easy for us to just swallow it back into our single bracket space. And that's what this picture is showing. That's what the human condition has been. And what we're doing now is saying, no, we need to go this way. We need to get this is within. That's what we're doing. The move from this to this is the journey to source. It's just a visual. Again, the deepest pattern of humanity in our language is to download the higher word into our space, and we could say it's higher and lower here. There's the word of God. God is transcendent. There's the eternal. There's reason. Here's the senses. We can make these splits within the space, but we still are downloading the higher into the finite. This is finite. This is transfinite. The source code is transfinite. That means it's infinitely interflow. And we can't fool around with that. We can't just pretend that our finite, comfortable mental technology of naming things and putting them in their categories and their narratives and making identities and differences and putting things and designating that way and packaging our worlds that way, which is what we do with our motherboard, which we're calling a motherboard. We cannot bring the higher code down into that space. And that's what we do. And it's almost forgivable in a way because that's what's familiar. That's the technology we use. That's our dominant cultural consciousness, experience-making, world-making, culture-making technology. So it's appropriate to think that we're going to, without realizing we're downloading it here, we cannot bring the infinite down into the finite space. And even if we can say, I can go on to infinity, 1, 2, 3, 4, ad infinitum. Ad infinitum, ... I can go on and on. If I'm numbering, I can keep going. Can't I reach the infinite in my space? The answer is no. And our teachers have seen that. There's no procedure within the finite space that can go on and reach. You can't reach the infinite. It's transfinite. There has to be a different procedure to enter from one to the other. And that's the great crossing. So just remember this, please, that we're moving from this picture where we swallow within this motherboard the infinite to a place where we get it right. The infinite is on the outside and the finite code is being funded by it on the inside. This is correct and this is grossly incorrect. And in a way, our journey to source is to give this picture up and rise to the more correct. This is last time number 19, and let's come back to where we are now. Familiar territory. It's important to see because when you see the finished product here, we can forget that it took centuries to be able to get this right. Here's the double brackets, and here is the single brackets within it, not the other way around. And you can't take the infinite and pull it down into You can't take the scripture and translate it into our terms. We've got to upscript to get it. This is the journey to source. And I hope you get the intuition, the scientific, when you step back from looking at symptoms of human life here, whatever it may be, and you start to look at it from the double bracket lens, the global lens, the awakened lens, the enlightened lens, the source code, you can then see the single bracket and how it works and why it desources and why desourcing creates a disaster. So basically what we want to do in the rest of this meditation together, and I hope we're together on this. I'm going fast, and I'm trying to compress in our meditation centuries of labor to try and get it right, to get the double brackets on the outside, even to name the double brackets. That has not been done. And the single brackets has not been named, and you can't get one without the other. To call out the single brackets, you need the double brackets, and when you have the double bracket, the source code, now you can see it, and now we can say, wow, that's what our great teachers were seeking to bring out. That's how Buddha was saying, stop the suffering. Because medically, if we're in the desourced space, we're going to be broken off from the light, from being, from well-being, from truth, from the Dharma, from the yoga, from the Christ, from God, from reality, so whatever name we use, we're somehow profoundly cut off. And this line is the main reason for human pathologies and dysfunction. We cannot flourish here. As great as we are, as far as we've come, and we come because the force is calling us. The force is always calling us. The infinite force is pulling us and calling us to rise to source, to come up to the source, to come home to who we are as Logo sapiens, source sapiens, not Lego sapiens, to play with that. We're not Lego, plastic entities and objects. We cannot make ourselves into entities and separate items that we plug together. That's artificial synthetic intelligence and synthetic life. But when we go organic into the source, into peak performance and Zen, when we're zenning, we're zoning, and when we're zoning, we're being. And that's the journey that our great teachers are calling us to medically flourishing. And that's well-being. And that's happiness. So let's pause a moment and think about this, because just play with me, please. And I'd like to ask your help to do this experiment, that any word we use in our culture here that's broken off from its source, and here we have it here, any word in the box, if you take it across into the double bracket, time here, time, space, space, I am, love, love, democracy, democracy, education, education, meaning, meaning, science, science. Every word here, when lifted up into the source code, right, it releases its voltage. That's upscripting. And every word, single bracket, is funded by the double bracket. The word time, time, space, space, I am, God, God, beauty, beauty, music, music, truth, truth, knowledge, knowledge. This is huge. Why? Well, it's not obvious, because if I use the word knowledge here in the box, and I have a lens and a narrative, and I know, and knowledge is, I know snow is white, I know that the universe is expanding, I know that smoking causes cancer, I know that. Single bracket knowledge is going to always be with a certain lens of interpretation. And it cannot source itself. This is the main insight of source science, that the source is the infinite source. The field is the source. And if we're cut off from that, we're desourced. If knowledge is desourced, then who's sourcing it? We? If I have my science, and I'm Newtonian science or Einstein science or other forms of science, if I have allopathic medicine, or I have acupuncture medicine or Ayurvedic medicine, who is sourcing it? It's reality sources, being sources. That's where truth comes. So if you're having science here and it's cut off from the source, it's going to then fall back into, well, our consensus makes it true. We're sourcing it. Our reality, as rendered here, my reality is sourcing the truth. So my truth then becomes pathological in some sense. It becomes relative to our conceptual framework and my lens. Your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth. Here, any word we use in our life, in our culture, that's broken off from the deeper source is going to be dysfunctional in some profound way. Ethics, how about ethics here? Because I know what's good and evil. And then Nietzsche is saying we've got to go to be an Ubermensch. We've got to rise and step back from the slave mind and come into the beyond good and evil as we know it here, into a deeper space to grow morally. If ethics is up here, you've got to leave this space. So all of our good words that we have, and our pathological words, if you put it in the box, when you open it up and say, wait a minute, let us realize that whatever is going on in my culture, democracy within this space is not democracy here. For example, democracy here, we the people, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all humans are created equal and endowed by God, source, infinite, with unalienable rights. And if anything blocks that, we have to separate from it. 1776. We the people, one nation, under God, indivisible. That talk, one people, indivisible, under source, with liberty and justice for all. That kind of talk is huge. Is it here or here? So American culture here, it just choose that example. Democracy can be impaired in some way if we don't tap the source of reason, of the light of reason, and get to the high ground where we are pluribus unum. The unity is pluribus here. The unity, infinite unity, is infinitely diverse, and diversity flourishes in this deep space, and yet with unum and community and connectivity and we. We can't be we here. So if we look at, say, American contemporary culture in the 21st century and see the ideological battles and the polarization, and people are talking about alternative facts and alternative truths, and there's the alt-left and the alt-right, and one is true and they're different, and you look at the news and it looks like, what's real? Whose truth? The people seem to be divided in their consensus as to what is true. What's true for that large portion of the population is not true for this. It's just two realities. And how are you going to get the people together? How do we bring the nation together? The civic space. Because if the civic space is fragmented, which is what's going to happen, then medically you will see the medical pathological dysfunctional aspects of civic life here. It's monologue. What is monologue? It's where you see the other as an object in your own lens, rather than dialogue, where you and the other are open in mutual respect, in the moral law, in the unum pluribus space of deep dialogue. Dialogue, monologue. Can we have a civil space, a civic democracy, in a polis, a community? A polis is the name for the public space. A polis. Can we have a healthy polis here, or is it fragmented and broken by the disconnected from source? Or must we be in the source of the unum pluribus to have a healthy flow of dialogue in the life of the people together, where every individual is sacred and unique, and yet connected in that shared sacred space? So democracy can be ill. I'm just taking words and trying to illustrate that as long as you're disconnected and in the fragmented, why does this matrix fragment? Because it's working pre-critically, unconsciously, with a deep evolutionary stage of identity. A is A, B is B, either or. Snow is white, or it can't be white and not white, that kind of thinking, which is a basic stage of logical development, but it's not mature logic, it's not mature reason, which is going to be deeply coherent. Coherence is deep connectivity, unum, where the dots are connected already. And that's deep reason. So if we're disconnected, if we're disjointed, It's going to be broken and scattered and like Lego pieces put together. And it's going to be synthetic and not real. And it's going to easily unravel. And there's not going to be a foundation. There's no foundation here because it's been cut. The foundation is here. The foundation is here. The foundation is holding us, but we're cut off from it. And if we're cut off from our foundation, which is our source, which is our ground, which is our common ground, the infinite source that's funding us and making our life and breath possible, but we are denying it and cut off from it, that's not a healthful and healthy situation. That's not organic. That's not authentic being. There's something inauthentic about it, and everything in our lives is going to be, can I find love in this space? If love is an I-thou intimate, sacred connection with lovers here in the I-thou space and not an I-it. If your lover is an it, without thinking about it, you're the greatest thing in my life. I mean, we just think that way. Because everything, this is everything. And everything is being objectified. And if we objectify, that is a profoundly violent posture in our maturation as humans. It's pre-human. It's dehumanizing to objectify. And if we objectify, it can lead to disasters in our political, social, intercultural lives with each other. We can easily have racism and sexism and supremacy and absolutism. My view is the only absolute truth. That comes here. The absolute is here, and it's infinitely deep and open. So whether it's the truth of Moses or Buddha or Krishna or Lao Tzu or science in the deep space of Unum Pluribus, these are all co-possible in the high space. But here they compete. Is it Yahweh or is it Allah? Is it Brahman or is it Buddha? Is it Lao Tzu or is it science? Which narrative dominates the story of reality? If you get plural and says, okay, let's have pluralism, and each has its truth, then you can degrade quickly into relativism. There is no truth. You have your truth, I have mine. I'm a Christian, I have my truth. You're a Muslim, you have your truth. You're a Jewish, you have your Judaic truth. You are an atheist, you've got your truth. You're a scientist with ecumenical reason, you've got your truth. And everyone has his or her truth. And truth is relative to your worldview. And there are many worldviews in the pluralistic space. So that truth becomes relative to your world and your lens and your narrative. And there are many narratives, and they all have their truth. And it becomes subjective. And there is no common truth. My facts are my facts, your facts are your facts. Because a fact here is a part of your world. The fact for a person in the biblical world, that Genesis is the origin of our world. God created the world. Physics, cosmology, science, Big Bang. And Darwinian evolution, that's the fact. But which is the fact? The objective fact. It's going to be relative. So facts get broken. So what is a fact here is not a fact here. What makes sense in this worldview doesn't make sense here. What is meaning? So meaning gets broken. Meaning is broken. Reason is broken. Which logic? We know there are alternative logics. There's classical Greek logic. There's modern mathematical logic. There's a logic of Hegel. There's a logic of Zen. There's a logic of Buddha. There are different logics. Which is the right logic? And if logic is the DNA for reason, and there are different logics, then logic is dysfunctional. There's no coherent logic. And when you go into the deep space and get the missing code, that's when you get the deep motherboard, the deep source logic of all logics. So that when you start to look at all kinds of symptoms here, ideological wars, what is ideology? Ideology is not here. Ideology is generated by the worldview and the cluster of beliefs. An ideology is a system of ideas, or ideology, a worldview, a narrative, a belief system that you're holding according to your paradigm. And there are many different ideologies. So if you're in ideology, you're somehow you're embedded within a relativism or absolutism war. Is my ideology the ideology of science? There's an ideology there, which is your conceptual structure. Your narrative theoretical structure gives you your ideology. If you're using the Einstein way of thinking, then that's an ideology, or Newton, or Ptolemy, or Copernicus, and so on. That's an ideology. So if there are different ideologies and you want to get out of ideology and get to truth, then if you want to stop ideological extremism, you can't solve it here. If you have, therefore, racism and sexism and homophobia, to mention just three of the pathologies, that cultural, societal pathologies that are in our face for centuries, but now, ethnic cleansing, Holocaust, genocide. What is that about? Objectification, being ungrounded. Why? Because if you're here, you never treat the other as an object, but always as a sacred other. And to cross into the high space of compassion and ethics and mutual respect and dialogue, right? That's where culture must go to survive, because here, being cut off and desourced, it's in a meltdown for centuries. And despite all of the great breakthroughs in medicine and technologies and internet and telecommunications and global economics and global corporations, if that's considered an advance, is questionable, rather than local economies, right? And all of the great advances in technology and the jet age and internet and so forth, they couldn't have it without the source. Every advance is being sourced. We're always being sourced. So the source is calling us and helping us with technologies to rise. But now we've reached that area where we've got to make the crossing to overcome our deep pathologies. That's the main meditation here in the 20th meditation together, to start to rethink this. I know this is a lot. So if you take any, what I'm suggesting, just to sum this point up before we go deeper, any aspect of our cultural life being desourced and cut off from source is going to have the virus of this motherboard. Because all our life is under this motherboard and made possible through our motherboard, even though we're always situated in the zone and couldn't motherboard without the zone, without the source. I hope that's clear. The infinite is infinitely with us at all times, and we have the code within us. That's granted, but somehow it's blocked and cut off. Why? Because we're using a thought form, a matrix, a program, a thought form, a program, a motherboard. Let's go to the mother, that's what we're calling it. Just as though to use the computers, it has a program that makes it work. Well, we have a deep implant program, which we're calling out the motherboard that gives us information. And we can Google the information here, that's here. But it's not the same as the language, the code, the matrix of the double bracket space. Where when the mind awakens to the I am and the I thou and the other is already within you, because nothing can be cut off from the other. There's no separate atomic unit. Here you can have Lego blocks, separate entities, everything, whatever it is with a name. That's a nice analogy. But here nothing can be itemized that way. The unit here, to be a unit here is not the same as a unit here. When I say I am and I realize I'm connected with the entire field, I don't lose my individual, I go to a higher form of integrity. When you're in the yoga space, when you're in the Christ space, you're in a deep integrity, individuality. You don't lose it, you gain it. Because individual means not dividual, not divided. I hope that's clear. Just the word individual. Dividual means divided, dual. Individual. Dividual is dual. Not dividual means integral, and that means unum. So when we rise in upscript, we gain our uniqueness and individuality as humans with each other. And we can't cut off, we don't have to cut it off and put it in a box with my information, as this calculus does preconsciously and explicitly. When I say I here, I am my own identity. I've got my own separate ID. Thank God, we think. But it really cuts us off from ourselves. Because when you're here in the single bracket, you're cut off from your double bracket self. And the journey to know thyself is to rise out of this entrapment of an adolescent technology, a matrix, to where we objectify, to becoming in the civilized space of encountering the other and everything around us as a sacred presence. This is the place of presence, I, thou, dialogue. This is the place of objectification, I, it. So all of our symptoms here, someone who feels lonely and loneliness, that comes from here. Loneliness, loneliness is not here, because being alone is to be profoundly connected with the infinite and with nature and with others and with yourself. That's interconnected. To be alone here is not to be lonely. To be alone here comes with the territory of being a separate entity. So if we just take that one symptom, loneliness, I feel profound loneliness. I feel isolated, right? What's the science? What's the medical? You're cut off. You're desourced. I'm feeling despair because my life and my meaning, here's my meaning in here, but it's cut off from real meaning, the real deal, here. And I'm feeling all kinds of life anxieties and emptiness and despair and depression. What is depression? We can understand depression as we do and medicate the depression and get a prescription to help with the depression. But could there be a deeper cause medically in ontology, medical ontology for depression? Can we be ontologically depressed? What does that mean? My being is cut off. I'm not being. Something is reality. I'm not touching reality. I'm longing for life, for happiness, for well-being, for truth, for meaning, for love, but I don't have it. Why? Because I'm desourced. So how many human psychological, personal anguish? I feel broken up inside. I don't feel like, I don't have integrity. I feel disintegral. I have multiple mood swings and distractibility. I can't stay focused. Why? I have no Unum. If you're going to do the yoga, you can't do yoga here. Yoga here is not healthful, because yoga in this space is cut off. But the whole point of yoga science is to get real here. Enter the Om, live in the Om. This is well-being. This is the Atman. That's the name for the high self. When I'm Oming, I'm in the high space. When I'm Christing, I'm in the high space. When I'm Buddhaing, I'm in the high space. When I'm Logos and turned on to rational light and life, that's when I'm in the high place. And if we're cut off from that, we're going to be in the dark. And we're going to feel it. Suicide, addiction. Why such rampant addiction of opioids flourishing in our culture here? What's the source of it? I can go to a retreat center to detox and overcome my addiction and do some yoga and do some chanting and do some meditation to try and overcome my addiction. And I can go to AA meetings, which is great. I'm not trying to put that down, because when you go to the 12-step program for alcoholic addiction, it says there's a higher power. And I surrender to the higher power. And the 12 steps, allegedly, to get me into a higher life, to break the addiction. Beautiful, but when you see it in the double bracket sense, the 12 steps, for example, to overcome addiction. What is the depth of addiction? Buddha saw it. It's addiction to the matrix. It's so deep. It's got such control of our lives. We're colonized by it. We don't know it, and we're not free. And if we're not free, we're going to feel it. And it's going to show up in so many different ways of life, and anguish and despair, and the loss of meaning and midlife crisis. It's going to show up because our hearts are calling us to go into Source. The Source is calling us to be who we are. But our technology of consciousness and culture that we're embedded within is cutting us off and holding from ourselves and from others and from life and from well-being and from flourishing. So life here is, in a way, it's pathological. Every word here is somehow desourced. Love, there can be a love sickness, a love pathology, because if you objectify each other, you can't truly love. You have to enter the deep space to love. This is the place of lovers, sacred space. This is sacred. This is not sacred space. This is objectified by the technology that we have not sufficiently seen and called out. We're colonized by an objectifying motherboard that's smothering us from our life and from each other and from well-being and from scripture and from reality in the direct, deeper, higher way of knowing, and turning on our brain power into this space, and we're downsized here in life here. So any word we use in our everyday culture is going to be carrying the virus of this motherboard, and therefore you'll see the signs of pathology and dysfunction. Take the word time, single bracket time. Past, present, and future are separate. The past is over, that piece is gone. Future is not yet, now is moving, and I can't tap it because it's moving all the time. That's time, single bracket time. And I've got deadlines, and I've got due dates, I've got to do this, I'm feeling stress. I don't have time to breathe and to feel and to smell the roses and to enjoy the presence of awakened life in single bracket time. So time crunches us. Whereas time crossing from time here to time here opens up deep time. So when we hear of the power of now, that's here, double bracket time. When time is here, it's squelched. It's a pathological time, linear, closed, broken time. In the place of this motherboard is cut off from deep time, open time, presence. Life, let's use the word life. Can life be pathological, my life? Yes, because if it's in the smother life, it's going to be marked with death. Life here is a life that dies. But if we listen to our great teachers, life here is everlasting because it can't end. Why? Because the infinite source cannot end, and the connection with the space of life. Death here has a different meaning than death here. Death here is a terror that people live with, but do we understand death in the high noble source ontology, where our great teachers say that life, double bracket life, is transmortal? That this technology creates death. This causes death. Single bracket death is not the same as double bracket death. And if we're going to have hospice care for people who are in despair at the end of their lives, or they're losing a loved one and they're in deep melancholy and grief, right? And they could understand the literacy and understand the ontology of death. Death is an ontological phenomenon. And if we have bad ontology, we're not going to get it. Single bracket death is terrifying. And that's an example. Just take that one word alone. And we live in the shadow of death, and we try to get away from it, living in single bracket time and single bracket space. So I'm right here and I'm not over there. Whereas double bracket space is omnipresent. Presence is omnipresent when you enter double bracket space. And to get time, you haven't got space because it's space-time continuum. And when you get time and space, you're going to get mind and open space. And the word is opened up, and the world is opened up. And being is presence. And life and freedom is free range. So freedom is here, and this is colonized life here. I hope you're following the main meditation. Is that it's not just that you have anxiety and depression and suicidal thoughts and addiction and that insomnia, and you can name so many different well-known, well-named pathologies from medicine and psychology, psychiatry, psychotherapy. You know, we have many names for it, and then cultural analysis of ideology and sexism and racism and the dynamics in the culture that we say this is pathological. Sexism is not right. Why? We're objectifying the other and dehumanizing him or her. Racism, right? And ethnic. Where does that all come from? From identity. Identity ontology. Where does identity come from? This is the name of the game. Everything has its name and its place and its tag, and then now it's objectified, and now we play the politics of identity, ontology, without even knowing it. So phenomena that are well known, like racism, we know we've got to end racism. And hatred. What is hatred? Fear of the other. When we objectify the other and have phobias of all kinds, fear of the other, fear of yourself, fear of the source, that's one of the great fears. There's a deep fear and phobia to cross into the God space, into the infinite source space, into yourself. If yourself is here and you're here, and yourself is always with you, we got that here. Remember that the double brackets is always with you. our double bracket self is always with us. So wherever I am already there. So my high self is there, but it's haunting me. And we're terrified to let go of my single bracket ID to get a deeper ID. That's autophobia, fear of ourself, fear of the source, fear of God, fear of the infinite. Why? Because you got to lose something. You got to lose your comfy ID, identity, and story, and narrative, and perspective, and worldview, and interpretation in order to go higher. And that feels like a death. You almost have to die to go into the source, and that's fear. There's a terror of facing reality, the deeper presence of reality. So this meditation, and we'll go deeper in the next meditation. I've kept you here quite a while, and it's enough. And I just want to sum up for what we'll do next, because my list is like over 100 words. I can easily pick out 100 key words from this place and show why it's pathological. It's dysfunctional. Space, I can say space. Love, life, freedom, agency. Do I think I'm free? I'm agent? Or is agency blocked from real agency here? Happiness? Is happiness here really legible and authentic, or is it happiness here and flourishing as our great teachers? Well-being. Being is here, and being well is you can't have well-being here. You have to cross an upscript into being. That's ontology. So medical ontology is the art and science of well-being through I-aming, because you can't find well-being and tap being in artificial severed space. You've got to cross into the space of being. So when we are heads up and mindful and awake and enlightened and rationally aware, we're tapping into being, and that's a place of well-being. And well-being is happiness, and happiness is freedom. And this life, liberty, happiness, the American dream, for example, if we understood it, 1776 here is not the same as 1776 here. So you might say that the journey, just to take the American culture example, since the founding of 1776 to where we are now in the 21st century, is a warm-up to get ready. Women vote, no slavery, end of apartheid segregation. Gays are humans and have rights, and we want equality in the culture. All of this is preparation. Stop the racism. Stop the sexism. End homophobia. Stop objectifying each other. All preliminary for crossing into the land of the free. That's the source culture, the deeper matrix of I-thou dialogue. An honor to each other, and respect, and holding the space, the sacred space with the source. So we can pause in this journey and sum up. So what's the main point? The main point, if we discover that there's a matrix that's cutting us off from source and life and well-being and happiness and love and relations and respect for each other and multiplicity and diversity, and to thrive in this civic space here, with a code, you need the code, and to get the code, you can't just jump in and arrogate your way into it. You've got to say, I am. Deeply, authentically, I am, and wake up and sustain it. It's a sustainable I am, because the I am is I-thou. Because when you're I-aming, you're I-thouing. And when you're I-thouing, you're in presence. When you're in presence, you're connected. You're in the continuum. You're in the Unum. It's all flow. You're zoning and zenning. That's the high life. That's well-being. That's where we're meant to be. But alas, we're somehow embedded in this space because we haven't seen the hidden matrix. Because we look over here, we look here. That's our box of our culture and our experience and our meaning. And we can't step back and say, oh, there's a matrix that's cutting us off, and we need to now step back and make our journey into the high ground together, personally, individually, and collectively. So what is a pathology? What is a dysfunction, an existential ontological dysfunction? Personal, cultural, interpersonal, intercultural, interreligious. When worlds collide, what's going on? What's the source of that? It's the technology we're using that separates our worlds and our narratives and our perspectives, all vying for truth and meaning and predominance in this space. Or if we pluralize it, then we have relativism. Either we have an absolute, one truth, let's say science rules, that gives us the truth and the facts here, and religion is secondary, that's not authentic truth, or there are many truths. And if there are many truths and many cultures, so pluralism and honoring the truth of each worldview opens up the place to what's called relativism. Truth is relative to your story. There are many stories, so grow up and accept the pluralism. That's a lot to process. So let's then gather and focus for the next session to go deeper, to see and trace how any of aspects of our cultural life in this space is going to have the virus. It's going to have the virus of the smotherboard. And if it does, it means it's going to be cut off from a deeper source reality. And therefore you'll see the signs of that. For any word we choose and pick out, it will show up in that fragmented space. And we're going to keep on going deeper and deeper to see how source medical science will address those pathologies in a way we haven't seen before. So one of the main points we're exploring in this journey into source medicine, source science, and source life is that when we step back into the double bracket lens of source science, the source code, and look at the human situation here, that any of the phenomena in our lives is going to be tainted with being cut off from and desourced. And if it's desourced, it's going to have some form of pathology in it, some form of dysfunction. We don't have to use the word pathology, but it's going to have some kind of dysfunction. So for all of our medical and psychiatric and psychological and cultural diagnoses, like things like racism and sexism and ideological extremism and terrorism and violence, those are huge words. Could it be caused by the technology that dominate our lives? To end violence, can we end it here, or must we go into the non-violent place? This is non-violence, this is violence. When we objectify ourselves and each other with an I-it matrix, it is violent. The culture is coded with violence. That needs to be seen. To go non-violent is to call out the smotherboard. Because if the smotherboard is generating objectification, and that is what breeds racism and sexism and homophobia and Holocaust and genocides and wars and all of the forms of objectifying nature and the degradation of nature because we objectify, then to solve those ailments of culture, we can't solve them in the space that produces it, but we have to get the science and see that the smotherboard is generating these disorders, and to solve them we've got to cross into the nonviolent, healthful, organic space of ethics and compassion and love and beyond I-it to I-thou. That's astounding. I hate to use that word so often, but when I use it, it's one of my go-to words to just say it is boggling, mind-boggling, to say that we can't solve racism here in this cultural space. We must solve it by going beyond racism here. Sexism, homophobia, all of the ways we violate each other, which is being generated. We've got to see that. There is a matrix that's generating objectification and seeds violence by its very nature and breeds violence. And to end the violence, we need to go higher into where our teachers, the Buddha, Jesus, Moses, Muhammad, Krishna, Lao Tzu, just to mention a few, have been calling us to rise into the place of ethics and compassion and well-being, to be really fully human. We've got to mature and evolve. So our pathologies cannot be solved within this space because it's generated by a deep technology that breaks us apart and creates synthetic relations. So for example, love is synthetic here, but love is organic here. Intimacy is I-it, codependency, and here there's interdependency. So this meditation is just meant to open that up as a deeper diagnostic for every aspect of our lives that it would be dysfunctional. All of our existential crises, by being cut off from being, and personal crises, interhuman relations, because our relations are objectified and not really organic. So we can't have love, we can't have intimacy, our sexuality is objectified. On every level, there's a dysfunction or a pathology lurking. And to solve it, we've got to rise into the higher space of nonviolent I thou culture. And that is the medicine of opening up, finding our access to the source code and the ontological medicine, medical ontology. Thank you very much for staying with me through this, and we'll pick this up next time and go deeper into look into the breakdown of democracy, the breakdown of dialogue. How do we use dialogue as medicine to heal? Because dialogue is here. So when we enter deep dialogue, we can heal the brokenness of monologue. This is monologue. We can't dialogue here. Single bracket dialogue is not dialogue. Real dialogue takes us into the open space of dialogos, for example. So if we call for dialogue, but we're still in the undialogue monologue space in technology, the matrix is monologic. Monologue, my lens, is I'm seeing the other with my lens and not opening up my lens. How do we open up and dilate our hearts and minds and lens? We've got to go into the space of dialogos, dialogue. It's an example. That's the pathway of healing. A wide-ranging pathology, that's the end of suffering. Thank you so much. And please stay with me and let's go deeper. There's so much more to travel together on the way to life in the source life. Thank you very much.